Japanese people have felt the weight of our land, air, and naval attacks. Our blows will not cease until the Japanese military and naval forces lay down their arms in unconditional surrender.
By the time President Truman assumed office in April 1945, the United States was winning the war against the Japanese and moving swiftly toward a land invasion of Japan's home islands. But over 3 years of fighting in the Pacific had been every bit as perilous and costly as the war in Europe. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan captured the U.S. outposts of Guam and Wake Island, and the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore. In the Philippine Islands, Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, was ordered to flee from a Japanese invasion, leaving behind 100,000 U.S. and Filipino troops as prisoners of war. MacArthur vowed revenge.
I shall return.
Despite the disastrous start, American spirits were lifted in April 1942. Colonel James Doolittle led a successful bombing run on Tokyo in a move designed to strike fear into the very heart of the Japanese. A month later, in the Battle of the Coral Sea, U.S. and Australian forces resisted an enemy attack, preventing a Japanese invasion of Australia. In June 1942, the Japanese launched a secret plan to capture a U.S. military outpost at the Midway Islands, 1,000 miles from Hawaii. But the U.S. intercepted a secret communication and sent a carrier group to ambush the approaching armada. Japan struck first. Waves of warplanes attacked U.S. forces on the island, inflicting heavy damage. The U.S. responded, sending torpedo planes and dive bombers to attack the Imperial fleet. The first squadron met fierce resistance and suffered tremendous losses. But then, within the space of an hour, the U.S. turned the tide of battle by destroying 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. By late afternoon, Japan was in full retreat. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the war with Japan. From that point forward, the United States was on the offensive. General MacArthur devised the strategy of island hopping to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. The U.S. would island hop past Japan's heavily defended islands and seize the more easily defeated outposts. There, the United States could build landing strips and employ air power to cut Japan's supply lines. By August 1944, the U.S. was island hopping steadily toward Japan, capturing Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. By October, the U.S. Navy reached the Philippines. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they fought the Japanese fleet in one of the greatest naval operations in history. The U.S. prevailed. General MacArthur had kept his promise to return. After the crushing defeat, the desperate Japanese began using what they called the Divine Wind, kamikaze attacks. In these suicidal maneuvers, Japanese pilots dove onto Allied ships in bomb-loaded aircraft. Kamikaze attacks destroyed 36 U.S. warships, badly damaged 368 others, and killed over 5,000 sailors. But the Divine Wind failed to stop the Allied advance on Japan. President Truman set November 1945 as the date for a land invasion of Japan. But to stage the attack, the U.S. would first need to capture the heavily fortified islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Advanced air and naval bombardments were meant to soften enemy defenses for an amphibious invasion. But once on shore, U.S. Marines were forced to fight a terrifying war of attrition. Snipers fired on the advancing soldiers from hidden entrenchments. The Marines fought back, using flamethrowers and hand grenades to destroy the underground enemy. When the last shots were fired, over 18,000 Marines had died fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. 90,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Over 100,000 Okinawans perished as well. Many of those who survived were homeless and shell-shocked. As the U.S. marched across the sea toward Japan, daily raids by American B-29 bombers were destroying Japanese cities and killing thousands of civilians. In a single firebomb attack on Tokyo, over 100,000 innocent Japanese were incinerated. For Japan, defeat was inevitable, but the island nation refused to surrender. The mounting loss of life worried President Truman. Military advisors cautioned that 250,000 American lives could be lost invading Japan. Shortly after becoming president, Harry Truman learned of the Manhattan Project, a code name for the best-kept secret of World War II. A nuclear weapon, powerful enough to destroy an entire city. Testing in the New Mexico desert proved the atomic bomb not only worked, it was even more powerful than scientists predicted. President Truman was faced with a sobering decision. Use the horrible weapon to end the war, or risk the lives of countless Allied troops in a land assault on Japan. With the urging of top aides and military advisors, Truman decided to drop the bomb on Japan. The Allies issued a final appeal to Japan's military leaders to unconditionally surrender. This was known as the Potsdam Ultimatum. Still, Japan's military leaders remained defiant. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, headed out over the Pacific toward the Japanese military center of Hiroshima. At 8 o'clock, the atomic bomb dropped clear of the plane. "43 seconds later, the city of Hiroshima was annihilated. That afternoon, President Truman again called for Japan to surrender. When Japan failed to respond, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, leveling half of the city and killing more than 60,000. By the end of the year, the death toll had reached more than 200,000 from injuries and radiation poisoning caused by the two bombs. Finally, amid scenes of unimaginable death and destruction, Japan's Emperor Hirohito capitulated.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
The Supreme Commander of the Allied powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
The war was finally over, and the world celebrated.